Welcome to the Catholic Table Talk podcast. This is where everything Catholic is on the table. New episodes Thursdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on most podcast platforms. Here's your host, William Sauber.
And Happy New Year again, everyone, as we are in 2025, our second show of the year. New Year, kind of maybe a little different style of how we do things on the podcast, but the same goal, the same style of in terms of bringing on guests and promoting their content or their website or books or whatever the case might be. And today we'll have on Dermot Curtin from the Scriptorium Project, and he's going to talk about his project and what they do. And again, this is just Catholic Table Talk. This is why we made the show. If you're new to the show, get Catholic stuff out. And basically, for any other Catholic media or Catholic publishers or whatever the case might be, we want to promote them here on the show because it's not really advertising or anything against them. We're just trying to build up the church, build up the faith, and come together as one to share the faith, and that's why I like doing the podcast so much. Real quickly, before we get to Mr. Dormant, if you have a show topic or a speaker request, please feel free to email us at catholictt@gmail.com. It's the fastest way to get a hold of us. As well, check out our website, catholictabletalk.com. I try to make some new posts up there daily. Also, thanks to today's sponsor, again, Dr. George Saguma. Dr. George Saguma is he practices physical, mental health, and holistic health healing. Find more about his service at drgeorge.com. Again, thank you for Dr. George Saguma for being today's sponsor. Again, today's episode is another great promotion that you might not have heard about this company before, but I highly recommend that you dig into it online. Also, they're on Instagram at the Scriptorium Project. A little bit about it. The Scriptorium Project is a catalog of rare texts for sale from the early and medieval church made available for the first time in English. So, again, everyone hears about the early church and somewhat of the medieval church, but this combines the rare texts and make them into English, which is fascinating all in itself. So without further ado, let's bring on today's guest, Dermot Curtin. So Mr. Curtin, thank you for spending the time to come on the show today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Great to be able to talk about this.
Awesome, absolutely. And like I said, I'm always fascinated by what people like you are doing for the faith and what they are. Just again, early church and medieval texts. I would never think to do that, but I'm glad that you are, because we need more of that. So
yeah.
So
there's quite a bit in terms of what that entails. I know that that's the banner headline for the Scriptorium Project.
Sure.
To give it as a summation. I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand the application of that. So a lot of the texts that are being drawn out are really important to the history of the church. Within Catholicism, we talk about Scripture, which has its own particular place, but also the more nebulous tradition. The whole idea of tradition isn't quite as well defined in the parameters for it. So the Scriptorium Project's kind of in that vein right there. The whole idea that there is this vast array of different saints and bishops, minds that have contributed to the intellectual welfare of the church for the last 20 centuries that are accessible to you. But in this case, historically, you had to know either ancient Greek or Latin, both of which are kind of beyond most people's scope anymore.
Right. No, definitely. People say, you go to Latin Mass, and I'm just like, I don't know any of the words. Like, I'm not that educated. I'm not, So, yeah, I totally understand what you're saying with Greek and Latin. And so, why is it important, though, to people, Dormant? Because, again, it is kind of out of people's range, so to say. And, again, a lot of people, they know about the early church, or they are people talk about the early church, not so much maybe in the medieval times, but why is it really important to people today? Because again, in today's society, people just kind of brush off church history, brush off rare texts, like just kind of go with the flow, so to say. So why is the project important?
Well, that's a good question. Um, I guess I kind of have to answer it in different facets
Sure.
because the texts that are produced, there are all kinds of different texts. So some of them are things like church councils and synods, which maybe they aren't particularly interesting outside of historians. Other ones are works of, we call it ancient church wisdom. So I think specifically of the work De Vita Vita by St. Augustine,
Oh,
which is one
sure.
of my favorites. It's on the good life. So what does it mean in his case? He wants to understand what it is to be happy.
Right.
Happiness is just as pervasive in 5th century North Africa as it is in our world today. And just like in our world today, how do you get at that? Augustine, being a good Neoplatonist of his time, makes a very linear argument. He says that no one is happy unless they possess what they want.
That's
Fair
true.
enough.
Yeah.
The challenge in doing that, though, is that in possessing what you want, in a transient world, it's going to fall apart. It'll turn to a skeleton in your hands. And when it does, you're met with unhappiness again. So naturally, the only thing that you can do is to be able to turn yourself to those things that are eternal, those truths, those values that are in play, namely God Himself. And it's his hypothesis out of this that its happiness can only be found in relation to God Himself. That's a really great argument. And there's wisdom that's attached to that, wisdom for our own day that just hasn't been accessed, sometimes because of language barriers, and sometimes it's because of the accessibility of those books. I mean, a lot of them have just been, they're probably on a bookshelf in like a local seminary in your town, but nobody touches them. And
Sure.
nobody touches them because they're not accessible. So going into the Scriptorium Project itself, this is not like converting it to a language that people understand, that's intelligible to everyone, at least in the modern world, but also having it readily accessible. Like you can go on the web and find those kinds of books now instantaneously because of this.
Right.
You can have the wisdom of the fathers at your fingertips, and maybe even things that were within the realm of the church that you hitherto didn't even know about. There's been a lot of work on the this is a strange cross section. She was a German nun, but also a famous playwright. Her name was Hroswitha, and some of her works represent a whole segment of literature that would otherwise be unknown. And just because she wrote in a language that's dead and unintelligible to modern academia, completely forgotten. You don't tend to see the Venn diagram of nun and playwright anymore. That's usually fairly
Yeah.
unusual. But she had
That's
a lot
true.
to say.
Yeah. I mean that's so true. And I think too. I mean, people say, well, the church doesn't change with the world. It's like no, it doesn't. But we also, I mean, we change, like you said. I mean, the not so much the text. We all change what we change it so people can read it. So, but bringing up, like you said, to say Augustine, I mean, happiness back then is still what happiness is today. I mean, it hasn't changed. So yeah, it's find those texts, finding that core, and going back to it. I mean, just today, Dormant, just fixing a toilet. Fixing a toilet at my work here, and kind of unhappy with it. And I'm just like, man, I could use a snack. I'm like, I could maybe go pray. I'm gonna go have a snack. Well, did that food really sell my frustration or my, craving for something? For like 5 seconds it did, but it wasn't eternal until I'm like, okay, I know what you were trying to do there, Lord. You're trying to give me patience and this and that. So, I turn it back over to you. And then, found peace. And then I'm like, okay, this is what you're doing. So again, find that happiness, which is eternal, which is great. And what better, what not better place to do it with all the saints and from all the hidden texts too. And I'm gonna ask you this question, Dormant, and I apologize. I probably should have asked this one earlier. But what really made you want to do this? What was your background before you started this journey? And when did you start?
So this goes back almost 20 years at this point. I was originally a theology undergrad at Villanova,
Okay.
and Villanova has this fantastic library, the Falvey Memorial Library, and it's very useful. But as you kind of go into its bowels, into like the real depths of the old library, there were great texts from maybe a century before, but the challenge is that they were in terrible shape. I mean, it looks like no one had given them any attention since maybe the First World War.
Wow.
But the information they had on histories of the Eastern Roman Empire, tales of Christianity in southern Arabia before the time of Muhammad, church councils in North Africa, things that are otherwise hitherto forgotten. So, like my experience of Catholicism growing up, like they'll talk about saints from France and Italy and Ireland, maybe a little bit of Germany and Poland at that, but that's
Sure.
about the extent of it. And it's not like I have any qualms with Aquinas or with Augustine, although he's from North Africa. Um, but clearly, the whole idea of Catholicism's universality is that it's everywhere. And there
Right.
was so much that was just, in my opinion, unexposed that we weren't even talking about. So, as a theology student, around 2005, I started to do some of the work myself, not even with the intention of publishing anything, but just having it publicly available for the people that I know. And then more people were interested, and then more people, and it just kind of grew organically out of that to
Right.
the point where it's this behemoth now that it's actually a little hard to manage
Sure.
independently. Um, so trying to be able to talk to uh, within the Catholic world, different seminaries, there was a lot of great work that's been done on the past in this subject. It's just it kind of falls between the cracks each generation. Around the time of the American Civil War, there was a French Jesuit, uh, Jacques Mignet, who had compiled a lot of these works and did a fantastic job at it. He created works, the Patrologia Latina, the works of the fathers in Latin, Patrologia Gracia, same thing, but in Greek. But nobody's really done much with it for over a century. So, building upon his work and trying to take those texts, which were left in Latin, the language of academia in the 19th century, and
Yeah.
giving it to a modern audience feels like a gift. In terms of what drives me, I have no idea.
Not even a guess, or not even
um,
no, you have to answer that if you don't know, but
so there's something about the continuity of the past, right?
sure.
So even in this building that I'm in right now, I think it was built by Irish powdermen around the time of the 1840s. In Irish,
Okay.
they call it an Gortamor, the potato famine. Um, Clearly, it's the same geographical location. It's the same faith. It's the same church. Everything is the same except for the variable of time. And it's the same with these texts. You're taking a document, somebody's cognitive experience of the world, and drawing it from the past into the present. It's a lot like time travel in that sense.
Sure.
Suddenly you're able to see the inner life of someone that you would have never had the chance to otherwise.
Like, I mean, that in itself is, I mean, very cool, especially if you're inspired by them and you dig into the life more. It can really become more life changing for you as a person as well. Um, so awesome, like I said, I apologize. I probably should have asked that earlier. So, and I might need your help with pronouncing this word, but what is meant by the word paralistics, and who is it? Did I say that right?
Uh, Patristics.
P. Patristics. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I don't know what your background with like classic languages is, but pater, like in pater noster, our father.
Okay.
Patristics refers to the writings of the fathers of the church. and it's usually like a subdiscipline. Seminaries usually give it uh, based upon their own kind of orientation.
Okay.
So usually within the Latin world, you'll talk about Augustine and Jerome and Cyprian and Ambrose. Those are considered like the Latin fathers. They all wrote in Latin. They all largely spoke in Latin. Some of them had a little bit of Greek, but they hated Greek. Augustine
Really?
goes on rails about that all of the time. Latin for him is the tongue that he wants to employ, and historically, him and Jerome have been kind of these poets. Uh, they are the kind of represent the world of Latin patristics.
Okay.
Their writing, when it's composed and collected together, informs the teachings of the church. So famously, Jerome wrote his 16 Vulgate. He took the Greek Bible, all of the scriptures in the New Testament are composed in Greek. He also took the Hebrew scriptures and put them into what the vernacular tongue of his time was, which was Latin. And the poetic beauty of which he has was predominant in the Western world until the Reformation, until the 16th century.
Really?
Other ones like Augustine, with his idea of original sin, becomes more predominant Catholic theology and is still taught. Original sin is something that he's postulating about based upon his own reading of the scriptures and theology. A lot of patristics is taking the biblical text and trying to be able to give it application to our world, because the Bible is very useful. It's just not a handbook on theology.
Right.
There are other groups of fathers that they talk about who are outside of the Latin world that are considered doctors in the original sense of the word. Docere to means to teach, as opposed to like the medical idea. But there's the Greek fathers, there's Cappadocian fathers. They'll talk about like the Egyptian fathers, like St. Athanasius and St. Anthony of the Desert. All of them kind of come together to form our tradition.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, I mean, Saint Ambrose, Saint Augustine, and Saint Jerome are probably the big three that a lot of people know are more familiar with. But like the Egyptian fathers, I mean, and again, this is not a pop-up question, but how many people know of those Egyptian fathers? Because it seems like it's very what's the best way of saying this? But they seem like they're kind of out there. It's like kind of Egyptian fathers, so not like Saint Ambrose or Saint Jerome. Am I going off on a rabbit hole there, or?
So there's bigger ones than others. St. Anthony didn't leave us a lot of writing, but his idea of monasticism, which would be later popularized by someone like St. Benedict, would be pretty influential. I believe Athanasius is a doctor of the church, and more recently, it was either Benedict or Francis had made an Armenian doctor of the church, which was the relatively, I think he's probably the first Armenian of any kind. We have no Latin writing by him whatsoever. But the way that he wrote and what he wrote about, he was an excellent teacher. He was able to articulate in a way that no one else could what it means to be a Catholic and a Christian in the world that we're living in right now. It's one thing to be able to live it out, but the value of poets is they're able to say the things that we feel that we understand, but they're able to do it eloquently.
Yeah, I mean that's so true. Yeah, exactly. I know what you mean there. So, okay, that's like you said. It's some of them are bigger than others, but I mean, again, they're still church doctors, they're still church fathers. So, still worth your time to look into them and learn more about them for sure. So, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, but what were really St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, and St. Jerome best known for? And with your work you're doing right now, what really kind of maybe stood out to you about them more, what you learned about them that you haven't before?
So I guess with those three in particular, starting with Ambrose, who I haven't mentioned at all yet, the biggest thing that Ambrose was known for, and Augustine mentions it in his Confessions, is his ability to read silently, which today we take for granted, right? I
Yeah.
pick up a book, I read it, I look at it. I don't need to say it out loud. But in
Right.
the ancient world, those two things were linked. If you were reading out loud. To read silently, he was considered some kind of genius for the 5th century to be able to do it.
Really.
And so Ambrose inadvertently becomes the father of this very distinctive scholarly tradition, which, I mean, imagine a library today if we all had to read out loud to read a book.
Oh.
Ambrose does other things. So famously, he was not, when he was elected bishop, he wasn't even a Christian yet. I don't remember the exact details of it. The previous bishop of Mindelarum, Milan, either died or stepped down, and the people of the town all pointed to Ambrose and said, "We want Ambrose as our next bishop." And so he had to be catechized in the process of taking up the episcopal see itself.
Wow.
And he has siblings who are saints, but his element of contribution to particularly Western Christianity is the importance of the intellectual life with the life of faith. Ambrose was a very smart guy. He was heavily politically involved in the events of the Western Roman Empire. How do you do that? How do you involve yourself in the civil life of the world and at the same time be faithful to the gospel itself? It's a question that we're still trying to be able to respond to. But Ambrose is the one who responds to it by saying, yes, you need to be involved in the day-to-day dealings of the world. In contrast to the monastics who say, we're going to live the gospel, but we're going to do it out in the wilderness. We don't have to deal with those kinds of things. There's too many temptations. There's too many inherent problems. And naturally, his influence on the young to middle-age Augustine was very important, because it was through Ambrose that Augustine had the same realization. And clearly his thought is still with us. Some of his works, like I didn't translate it myself, De Civis Dei, City of God, is a major work of Western patristics, which has influenced every element of our civilization, even going into things that you wouldn't consider have anything to do with Christianity, like the letter from the Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King quotes St. Augustine in it.
Really? I did not know that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I mean. That you learn more about these saints, you learn more about weird texts and more about the life, and it's really very, very inspirational and very mouth dropping, so to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So
So,
go ahead.
what were you going to say?
No, I was just gonna proceed, but you can go ahead.
A lot of this is what they call primary source. So we'll talk about tradition, but it's not tradition in some nebulous sense where we don't know where it came from. In a lot of cases, we do know where it came from. We just can't properly cite it because there's too much and it's too confused.
Sure.
So we have traditions. The church here, St. Joseph, there's a big statue out front of Joseph holding a staff that's flowering. Take a very large bet that most Catholics don't know exactly why that is.
I don't.
So it comes from a story from the 2nd century, the Proto-Evangelium of James, where it said that Mary was in the temple in Jerusalem and they needed to find a husband for her. And the way that they knew Joseph was the man for the job is that he came in, and as soon as he stepped into the temple, his staff started to flower. And that's why he's given that representation, which is very distinctive. But that is something that comes distinctively out of the tradition rather than the biblical text.
Right. Oh, that's very good. Lisa did not know that. And wow, that's something I'm learning so much here. That's why I love having people like you on, Dermot, because it's so eye-opening, mouth-dropping, and it's good that we're on promoting and yeah. So wow, awesome. So just one last question before we leave, Dermot, is because I know that you got some big things happening at where you're at right now, or pretty soon while we're recording. So, what helped these church fathers stay with the church in tough times? Because again, going back to Augustine, he was living difficult times. Find joy, find happiness, is get to the things that are eternal. Um, but we today might say, well, the church back then was maybe not as bad as it is now, or the civilization was not as bad as it is now. Whatever the case might be, people might bring up. How did they survive the tough times when they were having them?
Well, it's a really good question. I don't think it's. I think it's really difficult to be comparing times here. So the Dark Ages, which kind of befell Europe starting in the 5th century, was a real challenge. A lot of people had lost total faith in the institutions that existed. And the ones that were left by the Roman Empire essentially vanished overnight within a generation. So you went from these cities that were masterpieces of architecture and civil design to just nothing. Um, the term barbarian is always a little bit subjective, but in terms of organization, there was just the absence of so much. But being able to carry on through that, the church became the beacon of light in the West. So as civilization itself was crumbling, you saw people being able to cling to the church more fervently. And no place was that more clear than places like Ireland, where you
Sure.
would have the establishments of towns built around monasteries. And the enclosure there was very safe. You're able to come in and you receive the equivalent of social services. So they'll have nursing homes and hospitals and libraries and schools. But as soon as you left that enclosure, all bets were off. I have some concern that we might be entering a new dark age in the years to come, or something like that might also be true moving forward. Not in the terms of physical danger, at least I wouldn't expect that, but in terms of getting some level of real quality education and information.
Mhm.
It's ironic that we live in a world right now where information is so plentiful, but oftentimes it's heavily manipulated by whatever power that might be. I mean, our universities have just fallen apart in the last 40 years to the
Right.
point where any kind of college education is worthless.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on the spot there, and I think people, when they think of Dark Ages, I think they do think of more. I mean, they think of everything's kind of going on mentally, physically, that type of stuff. But I think you bring up a very good point that people might not be thinking about, or, and again, it doesn't matter. I mean, if you're Catholic, if you're Christian, it doesn't matter, whatever. But yeah, it's the world's not in a good place. I can see where you're going with that. In the future. Um, so that's why we gotta stick with great Catholic teaching. And lower case in that promote that type of stuff. So I guess real quickly, I mean, when do you see that? How far off you expect that? So to say. I know you can't see the future, but
Well, yeah, there's always challenges in trying to predict the future.
right.
If you look into the seeds of time and say which would grow and which would not speak now. I think that I think we're probably already in the midst of it.
Okay.
Uh, at least on the academic level, we see universities closing left and right. I think a new one in the United States is closing each week,
Wow.
especially amongst the liberal arts world. We see a general degradation of the humanities. I mean, there's a reason why my project is conducted independently and not via a university, because the
Sure.
humanities in general are just not respected. Uh, Everything becomes a question of research and research funding.
Right. Yeah, it's true. I mean, look at, and it doesn't have to be like you said, the liberal arts. It could be any campus university, and yeah, they are closing. It is kind of lack of I mean, again, and it's the universities, like you said, have gone not in a good way as well. So people are kind of losing trust in them.
Yeah. You see English departments and classics departments just being closed left and right because the
Right,
application isn't there.
right.
Everything is in IT or in medicine, which those aren't bad things,
No,
but losing the humanities is going to be a significant issue moving forward.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So let's do two more questions real quick here, Dermot. So where do you see this project? Where do you hope to be 5 years down the road with this project?
Um, I mean, I would like to see its continued expansion. Some of the challenge is in languages that are outside of the purview of classical, so Greek and Latin. Uh, there's barriers when it comes to documents that are, let's say, in Ukrainian or Georgian,
Sure.
Armenian. The biggest one is Syriac, the
Really?
language that you spoke. Uh, there are certainly Syriac Catholics and Syriac Christians. It's just that there's not a lot of people who actively speak and can translate that language for us. It's kind of a significant barrier. Hopefully, that will change in a few years down the line, where there's access to so many documents that otherwise have been unknown.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. Well, it's the Scriptorium Project. Find it on Instagram and online. And then just tell us maybe a little bit about the publishing. What are the top sellers? What are people kind of looking for particularly when they shop you?
So I think the biggest one is the life of Saint Mary of Egypt, um, which come to us in its Latin form, about an Egyptian woman who was able to effectively kind of help in the initial monastic movement. Um, there are other ones that usually relate to uh, kind of the lives of saints, some which are familiar, some probably not. Saint Richard is a relatively famous one in the English circles.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, like I said, I'll have the in the show notes. We'll have the links to the project, both like I said, on Instagram, also via online. Hopefully, everyone who's listening or watching the show, hopefully you spend a little bit of time researching, and like I said, it's definitely something worth looking into, especially as we start a new year and you want to grow your faith. You want to be inspired. You want to learn more about the saints, learn more about the early church in the medieval times. And again, these are kind of rare texts that like haven't been touched since the Civil War, which is pretty remarkable. So, Dermot Curtin, thank you again so much, sir, for your time today and for your work. Hope to see you on the show again real soon, and God bless you.
Oh, God bless you too.
Awesome. Again, it's Dermot Curtin one. Check him out. The Scriptoriumproject.com. We'll have the links in the show notes below, like I said. We'll see you next time. God bless, God willing, as we continue our walk through 2025. Hope your new year is off to a great start. We'll catch you next time. Stay in the state of grace. Go to the sacraments. And we'll see you next week on Catholic Table Talk.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Catholic Table Talk podcast, where everything Catholic is on the table. Don't forget to subscribe to Catholic Table Talk on your favorite podcast platform to get new episodes delivered directly to you every Thursday at 9 a.m. Eastern.